Welcome to Creekside Chats with Successful Real Estate Investors, brought to you by Steve Talker Capital, promoting prosperity and harmony to help you flourish in all areas of life. Join in as we explore the motivations and goals of real estate investors and how their ability to invest abundantly has provided them with the time and freedom to contribute to the world in a creative and thoughtful way. Now please welcome your host, Dr. Allen.
Hello, enlightened investors. Dr. Allen here with Ken Sheppard, who was a guest on episode 7 and 54. Ken once again graciously shares the wisdom of 40 years of out-of-the-box creative thinking and financing. Welcome back to the show, Ken.
Interesting that you choose a select multifamily because it's probably the safest area to be in terms of real estate investing. Self-storage is also very strong because in self-storage you have basically the same concepts as multifamily. It's just multifamily units without any residency. But multifamily is really a great area because unlike a house where it's 100% occupied by one tenant usually, right? It might be different. You know, they have these things like where they have multiple people in a house for substance recovery and things like that. Multifamily is, of course, the same as a single family in terms of you have a resident, but in multifamily you may have a multiple number of residents. So if one leaves, the whole property doesn't collapse in terms of revenue stream.
Right.
I think that's really important, and everybody needs a place to live. You don't need necessarily a place to go shopping, although people do go shopping. You don't need an office. Of course, we're learning that even more and more as the COVID-19 expands, how many people can work from home, and probably will even after this is over, whenever that occurs. And so, but multifamily is residential. And unless you're able to figure out how to purchase a property to live in the general population, there are tenants. And those tenants are paying for the mortgage of the landlord.
Correct.
So the really interesting thing about multifamily is that when you own a property and somebody else is making your mortgage payments for you, eventually you still get all the benefits of that. You get the principal pay down, you get the tax benefits of ownership, you get a lot of things that the tenants don't get. And I think it's possible for anybody to become a homeowner if they want to badly enough. You just have to want to, and you have to get the education, which is one of the main reasons I created the radio show, Making Money in Real Estate When You Have No Money, on Blog Talk Radio, which is 248 half hours, teaching people everything that I think is important to know if you're going to try and go out and become a homeowner or a real estate investor.
Mm-hmm.
But multifamily is such a great place to be, and there's opportunity everywhere and anywhere, from a building from the ground all the way to rehabbing an existing property and doing creative financing on something that's already existing that you might be able to get an owner to do something with you. I think in the current environment, in the fall and in the late summer, but more like early fall into mid-fall, we're going to see more of these properties come on market, and they're going to be available at prices that are very, very good, because there's a problem with the mortgage market right now, because a lot of the tenants, this is also why multifamily is as riskless as it gets in terms of real estate investing, but it does have its risk. I mean, look at with COVID, the government is telling people in certain areas, you don't have to pay your rent payments, we'll make them for you.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're going back and working with those people to get paid back later. But that hasn't been going on for 3 or 4 months and just starting now.
Mm-hmm.
And so the landlords have been in the position where they have to be responsible for the payments, because they're not getting, in some cases, the rent from their tenants. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not.
Mm-hmm.
I think so it any investment is, it's an investment. It's not guaranteed, but it has much less risk than anything else. And certainly COVID doesn't come along, once in how many decades, right?
Right.
Centuries even perhaps. And so it's not a reason not to buy multifamily properties. It's just a matter of just looking for those opportunities, just like you would look for opportunities in single family. You watch for the properties that are not kept well. You talk to property managers about properties that the sellers or owners are just, want to make a change, and things like that. But I just think multifamily is as good as it gets when it comes to ownership. And also, you're also going to see, I think, a lot of the larger hedge funds, lots of the larger REITs, real estate investment trusts, as well as small property owners of maybe 4, 2 even, 3, 4, 12, whatever it is, number of units, starting to think about, do I really want to continue to do this? And if I don't want to continue to do this, what's my option? Or what are my options? And also, one of the things we're starting to see is people that just not only don't they have the money to make their mortgage payments because of what's going on, but they're also not able to keep up with the rehabilitation of their properties.
Right.
So it's even harder to get tenants if you have to replace a tenant. And so you can always find opportunities. You just have to really be willing to look. But remember also, once you buy a multi-unit, just like a single family, that will be a continuing cash flow for as long as there's tenants in the property. And the longer you have the tenants in the property, the more cash flow you'll have, because the less you'll have to pay on your expenses, because certain expenses happen every month, but certain expenses don't. And the ones that don't are the rehab. So if you rehab a property, you're only rehabbing it one time, and then you have the benefit of it for years to come.
Right.
So I think it's really important to own multifamily and to work with multifamily, both on the property side and purchasing loans. We've done it that way too, where we've bought the loans from the investors who own the loans. Rather than buy the property, we've actually bought the loan.
The notes. Okay. Well, talk to us a little bit more about how it is that you and your strategic partners actually work with other multifamily investors. You mentioned that you purchased the notes, but are there other ways that you work with them?
Sure. Well, we work with them on purchasing notes. We work with them on purchasing property. I think that when you're dealing in smaller deals, like, a 2 to 10 units, say, you're going to have a different kind of investor than if you're doing 300 units. But the concepts are basically the same. Right. It's just a matter of what size properties you prefer to get involved with, because you could buy, I told a guy yesterday, I said, you could buy 24 doors and have an 80 unit, so maybe you want to have 24 doors, because then if you want to exchange them or sell one, you can sell one and still have 76 units. It's much easier to manage a multiple properties of smaller number of units than it is a very large property that is an entire project of, say, 300 units. And you also have to look at what's called the mix, and how many 1 bedrooms, how many 2 bedrooms, how many 3 bedrooms, how many singles, because the easiest property to rent is a 2 bedroom or a 3 bedroom. 1 bedrooms, not so much. Singles, definitely not as much. But we look at the mix. We look at the age of the property. We look at the cash flows. We look at what we think is the expense deductions, are going to be the expense deductions, I should say, that when you purchase a property, because lots of times we see gross rents figure it out, project it as to what they could be if it's
Mhm.
100% occupied. But many times we see less than we think should be deducted for expenses, depending on where you are. And
Mhm.
generally, if you use a rule of thumb, if you take your total annual potential income and you multiply that by 40%, that 40% factor is 40 to 45 is what you would want to deduct before you look at what's called your net operating income, which is your operating income from the property before taxes,
Mhm.
meaning income tax, not property taxes. Property taxes are an expense of running the property and included in that 40, 45, sometimes even 50%. Um,
Mhm.
and lots of times when I see things from agents, they've done 25 or 30. And so we say, well, you may think it's that because they say, well, it's the actuals, but the actuals don't necessarily reflect the future. And it doesn't continue to offer you contingencies and, maybe even a vacancy factor, because you can't consider that the property is going to be occupied 100% of the time, all the time. So you
Mhm.
have to put in a vacancy consideration and things like that. So we look at the internal rate of return, we look at the cash flow, we look at where the property is located, how long it's been in the condition that it's in. We have a tendency to buy properties that are in need of attention, whether it be a foreclosure, uh, um, a burnout, a probate, something that's pushing down the price, and more than likely it's going to need some attention, which are
Mhm.
called deferred maintenance costs. And
Right.
those are the things that you have to take into consideration, because when you buy, I'll give you an example. We bought a while back, I helped put together a deal for these young investors, and one of them lived where the property was close by. Another one was not close by, but he had excellent credit and cash, and I had the knowledge to put it together and help them make it happen. And they came to me to help them and consult them and make sure everything went right. And this was a property that we thought, and I think we're going to be right, it's probably worth completed and fully cleaned up and everything and fully rented about 225,000. And
Mhm.
we purchased it for 75,000. It's taking about 30 to 40,000 to finish it and rehab it and hold it until it's fully occupied. And we got it. It had one tenant. Now it has three. Um, and so that property, when it's finished, will probably have at least 100 to 150,000 in equity in it, just from making the purchase and buying the kind of property properly. If you do that 10 times, you're a millionaire.
Yeah. So do you prefer to provide debt, or do you prefer the equity side when you are working with investors?
Both.
Both.
Um, yeah. Well, the debt usually comes from an institutional investor, or it
Mhm.
might come from a seller participation, or it could come also from a bank, more than likely, probably private investors. And then the equity generally comes from either a seller contribution or um, or a investor or group of investors that go into the property as partners, whether they're active or silent. Um, and you have to have somebody that's like the managing partner that runs the operation, and they
Correct.
raise the money, however number of ways you raise capital,
Mhm.
and finish up the transaction so that it can be completed. I prefer to have less investors than more, because the more investors you have, the more people that you need to report to. You have to provide them with updates and things like that. If they have questions, you have to answer those questions. And so I feel that it's just easier to work with smaller properties with less investors and buy more of them than buy a 300 unit. I mean, we've done those, but our preference is the smaller properties. Like I mentioned, I'd rather have 10 4 units than one 80 unit. I'm sorry, 24 units than one 80 unit, it's just much easier to work with it, and much more. They're just easier to dispose of. You know, the buyers that will buy a 4-unit, there's a whole lot more of them that can afford that than trying to sell them a 300-unit.
Right. So you prefer those like 4 units, and you would prefer to have like I don't know, 8 units, eight 4-unit properties as opposed to one 24-unit property.
I think it's easier to work with smaller properties. 1 to 4 unit have you can do certain kinds of financing with them that you cannot do with a 5 and more.
Right.
When you get into 5 units and more, it's much more. There's not as many options for financing because of the way the government offers financing in certain cases.
Sure.
You can still get this other kind of financing, private, bank, whatever, just like you can get on a larger project. But a larger project, you really have, it's just not, it's more complex. And I've just learned that I'd rather have a whole bunch of smaller ones. Like Monopoly, would you rather have 5 properties on the board or 1 property on the board? You know, and if you have all these different properties as a portfolio, okay, of 4, say 24-unit properties, that's as valuable, if not more valuable, than owning one 80-unit property.
80 unit.
So, and it's also, you could have different investors on each 4-unit. You don't have to have the same ones. And I just think it's just my preference to do smaller, like the one I mentioned, the 4-unit that we bought for $75,000. It's worth now probably about finished up about 200 to 220. We're having it appraised right now to complete the refinance after we did most of the rehab, and we'll get the rest of the money for the rest of the rehab for the 4th unit out of the refinance. And then that's another thing, when you're dealing with smaller properties, there's more investors that'll help make those deals that are private guys. When you get into these much larger deals, they're more institutional people, and they don't usually use their own capital. Sometimes they use part of it, but when you're dealing in the private sector, you're probably dealing with somebody that has their own personal investment in it. Even if they're raising other capital, they're more than likely participating in the loan.
Right.
Or the equity.
The equity, yeah, generate the equity.
Sure.
I'm sure you go into a lot of this in your show here, but what are your suggestions for raising capital for a fourplex or even a portfolio of, say, 4 to 6 fourplexes?
Just like raising capital any other way, you know, you look for people that have funds that they're looking to put to work. You can speak to accountants, you can speak to property managers, you can speak to a lot of different kinds of people that know where people are that are looking to invest. If you're doing much larger deals, you can find them more like at golf courses and, you know, places where wealthy people visit. But I think when you're dealing in smaller projects, you could also expand that. You can do it on smaller ones as well. I mean, anywhere people either aggregate who have capital, like a golf course, a nice golf course, or something like that, or accountants who work with people who have money that they want to put to use, and accountants generally know which of their clients are in that situation. And if they're working with you, especially if they're your CPA, that's another thing. If they're your accountant will be much more likely to help you than another accountant that's not your accountant. because they have your client relationship with them.
Right.
So I just, you look to people that are in your circle.
Thank you for joining us on Creekside Chats with Successful Real Estate Investors, brought to you by Steed Talker Capital. For more information, as well as access to our free ebook on enhancing your well-being through real estate investing, be sure to connect with us at steedtalker.com. As part of our efforts to make the world a better place, Steed Talker Capital contributes to activities and organizations committed to better understand the equine and enhance the humane treatment of horses worldwide. Steed Talker Capital, working for a world where all creatures, great and small, flourish abundantly. Connect with us at steedtalker.com.